Amen. Thanks, guys. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. I think I know most of you, but if not, I look forward to chatting to you after the service and getting to know you. My name's Miriam, if we haven't met before. I'm here to share about your story, God's story, and hearing God's call and going where he calls. I'm going to share a little bit from my life, a little bit of the way that God has moved around and in my life, and a bit from the Bible, and then we'll look a little bit at what your lives might look like as well. So we're talking about calls, and there's a lot of ideas that we might have when we hear the word God's call. God called me to this, to that. But I wanted to start off with just a few things that God's call is not. So first of all, God's call is not a declaration of perfection. So Claire and Jared are awesome, but they're not perfect. If that's news to anyone, we may need to chat. They're wonderful, but they're not perfect because God hasn't called them because they're perfect. It's not a declaration of sainthood and everything being wonderful and easy from then on either. It's not even a promise of protection. God's call isn't a moment of eternal clarity. I have the call, now I know everything is sorted from here on out. That would be really nice, but it's not how that works. It's not the end of the story. I don't know how you guys feel about those Hollywood movies like the chick flicks and the rom-coms where at the end they get married and then they live happily ever after. And then it's like life just kind of everything is easy from then on. And it's not what God's call is either. It is not a proclamation that everything is happily ever after, that this is the end of your fight, your wrestle. But it's not just the start of the story either. It's not to say that everything that has gone before was not important, profound, significant. It's not even to say that you weren't called to where you were before if God calls you to somewhere else. What a call is something that will be heard or recognized or felt by a person who is willing to listen and a person who is willing to obey. That is all God asks of us, that we listen and that we say yes when he calls us. Claire and Jared listened and have said yes to where God has called them. So let's just have a little look at my story. I'm the blonde one in these photos that it's just about to come up. I'm the only blonde one. I grew up in a cross-cultural setting in the Middle East. My parents were cross-cultural workers there. And for some seasons of our life, my brother and I were the only non-local kids in the city. And other times we ran around with a bunch of other expat kids. In this picture where I'm holding a necklace, I had made it in a family or a Sunday school activity, and that day I got to be line leader and walked us all into class because I had a pretty necklace on. It was very exciting. I did get to see the pyramids, as you'll see in the next photo, and that was pretty exciting too. I'm the one, I don't know if you can see, but I'm the one in the little blue outfit. My mum made that for my brother, and then I wore it as a hand-me-down, with the Dora the Explorer haircut, the triangle head. That's me. So we lived in the land of the pyramids, but also pay attention to the girl in the red on the right, because she comes back later in the story. So I grew up in that context, and I went to boarding school in a different country as part of living overseas. And one day, while I was in boarding school, I got a phone call from my parents. And they explained to me that they had been travelling back from Australia to this country, and they'd been stopped at the airport. They'd been asked to step aside and wait some more and wait some more. They weren't allowed to go through security. In the end, the local friends who'd come to meet them at the airport paid a cleaner to smuggle a phone through security so they could talk to their friends and say goodbye. Because after about 24 hours of detention and questioning, they were put on a plane out, and that was the last time they're ever allowed to step foot in that country. Now, this was obviously incredibly painful for them, but also as a teenager, it kind of broke me. I didn't realize it at the time, but I developed this kind of theology of Well, that sucked actually. But, God wants me to just get up, because good Christians get up in the face of suffering and they keep walking. This is what we do. This is the good Christian thing to do. And it wasn't until many years later, when I was praying with someone and talking through with a counselor, that I realized actually I had developed a theology that said Jesus didn't care about my suffering, that he just wanted me to work for him. He wasn't interested in how I was feeling. And that meant that I wasn't letting Jesus get too close to me because I didn't want to get hurt again. Sometimes, in God's call and in following his will, we will experience hurt and heartbreak. We will be damaged and we will need healing. It's going to be a beautiful journey, Claire and Jared, but it won't be easy. There was a moment of beauty that came out of this. When I was in boarding school, I got an email from my parents in the weeks after this. They were staying in an intermediary country in the Middle East, trying to discern where God might have them go next, since they couldn't go back to their home, to the place where they had lived and ministered and worked and loved for 20 years. And so as they were praying, they settled on 3 countries that they wanted to pray about. They thought these would be the logical places to go next. They were praying about Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. So they sent me that email, and because Google Maps was a new thing, and this was very exciting, this was like 2004, 2005, I looked up these countries on Google Maps, and I saw the outline of each one, and the moment I saw the shape of Syria, with its little squiggle and its little straight line, I knew, oh, yeah, it's that one. I just had a little kind of ping in my heart. Yep, that's it, that's the one. But I didn't say it to my parents because I thought, well, I might be wrong, or this has to be their decision. They're the ones who are doing the work. So sure enough, a week later they emailed and said, yeah, we feel like God is calling us to Syria. And that's where they went, and that's where we lived after that. Sometimes God uses heartbreak to call us out of a place. And sometimes he uses a gentle whisper in our hearts, a quiet certainty to call us into a new call and location. So I finished high school and I moved back to Australia and I started studying at Bible college. And at Bible college, I had the opportunity to go on a study tour of Turkey, Greece, and Rome. This is back in the day when you could get it on Hextet. And so I was like, well, sure, why not? So I signed up for this study tour and went across and we did, I think, 3 weeks in Turkey and then a week across the other 2. And I learned a huge amount about the early church and Paul's letters and who he was writing to and what was going on, and it was all very amazing and beautiful. But I also came back with this interest in my heart in Turkey. Something had happened, something had snagged me. I had gone wondering what is God up to in Turkey, and I'd come back desiring to know more and actually wondering if I should be part of what God was up to in Turkey. But I had a degree to finish, so I came back and I wasn't really sure what to do with this question. So I just kept studying and I kept pottering on, but it didn't go away, that question in my heart. So one day I remember chatting to my mum and saying, well, look, I'd love to go to Turkey, even just short term, to suss out if this is where God might have me, but I don't want to go alone. That seems like a really big thing, even just for 3 months to figure out if I should be there long term. But I don't have a partner to go with, and really if I wanted to go with anyone, I'd probably go with my best friend Rachel, who, I'd been roommates with her and we'd grown up together, and she was the one in the red shirt in that photo of the pyramids. And I'd probably go with her. But I'm not going to ask her because she has a serious boyfriend and they're, looking towards marriage. They're not looking towards heading overseas, and she won't want to come with me, and so I won't think about it. And I didn't pray that, I just mentioned it to Mum, and I certainly didn't talk to Rachel about it. Turns out God hears us when we mention things to our mums, and he took it as prayer. Because about a month later I was catching up with Rachel for coffee, and after we'd caught up on all of the life stories, she said, actually, I was thinking about, I really am not sure whether I need to be in Australia or overseas, and I'm wondering about whether I go spend some time, just like a short-term exploratory trip, just a few months in the Middle East. but my boyfriend isn't really in a position where he can come with me, and he's really nervous about me going by myself. And he said, why don't you ask one of your friends? Why don't you ask Miriam? See if she can go with you. So I said, yes, please. And we went to Turkey. So nearly 3 years after that initial little ping in my heart, I was back in Turkey. Now, I went to work with local theological students. This is what I had decided I wanted to do. I'd actually specifically said, I don't want to work with refugees. I think that would be too hard. I don't think I could handle it. Because there's a lot of Syrian refugees in Turkey, and that was a nation that I loved and had grieved over the war in. And so I just had decided that wasn't going to be it for me. That seemed like the logical choice. And I was studying theology here, could do a bit of a theological exchange there. So all of these, we lined up programs, and I met with the agency that we decided to go with and talked about what that might look like, and Zoomed, or Skype back then, with the couple on the ground in Istanbul, and we talked about it, and we lined up all of these opportunities for me to work with local students. And then we got there, and bam, 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 all the doors closed. And so suddenly I was sitting at home twiddling my thumbs while Rachel, who I was going with, went out, and she's a social worker, and she went out to work with Syrian refugees. And I didn't have much to do. I had one class I could attend, but that was only 2 weeks of class. And each week she would come back and she would just mention casually that they just needed more people there to work with Syrian refugees. She's like, no pressure, I'm not asking you, I'm just telling you. That's fine. After the 3rd week, and when nothing else had opened up, I said, okay, I'll give it a go, I'll just see. And I went along, and it was the most intense and overwhelming thing I've ever done. It was interpreting. I was using my basic Arabic to interpret for Syrian refugees with a program that was providing support. I was trying to understand women in distress and high-stress situations, sharing their stories and asking for aid. I was trying to discern how to say, I'm sorry, we can't help you, over and over again in a way that would make sense culturally. And so my brain kind of melted. But over the coming weeks, I realized that as much as my brain was melting, I was feeling more alive than I had ever felt. And I was feeling like this was home, this was it. This was the most real life had ever been. So we're in Turkey for 3 months. And before I'd left, I had sent in an application on a whim for a job that would start after I was meant to get back. If, I got to Turkey and decided this wasn't for me, didn't feel like it was the right call, I could just go back to this job. But of course, you have to interview for jobs. So we did an interview over Skype, and I think it was God's will that this went well, because it was a 7 a.m. interview because of the time difference. And anyone who knows me knows that that's not really a time that exists for me. It's hypothetical in my head. So I did this 7 a.m. interview, and somehow it went well, and I thought, I think they're going to offer me the job. I need to have an answer. And I was only halfway through my 3 months in Turkey to discern whether I should be there, and I had to have an answer for this job. Did I go back and start working with them, or did I finish my final subject of my degree and come straight back to Turkey full time? So I prayed about it, and I just had a picture of, have you ever seen a cobweb strand that just kind of flies in the wind, like this, it's kind of floating in the breeze? And I just had that picture, and it sort of felt like God was saying, there's just things that are unfinished. There's stories that aren't tied down yet in Australia. You need to go back to Australia. So when they did offer me the job, I accepted it, and I went back to Australia, and I was really mad about it for 6 months. I was a hot mess. You talk to my friends and family about that time, and I think they survived, but it wasn't a graceful or gracious experience for them, because I was really angry to be back in Australia, because I had felt like I was doing this incredible work, I had felt like I was useful, and I loved it, and God had called me back. And I remember talking to an interim minister who'd said, does anyone want prayer after church? So I chatted to him, said how much I was struggling. And he prayed for me, and I started just burst into floods of tears. And he said to me, after he'd prayed for me, he said, are you sure you're meant to be back in Australia? Like, you seem very distressed about it. And through my floods of tears, I'm like, I'm so sure. Because sometimes God calls us into a place where we don't want to be, but it's the right place. And I was so sure. So we came back to Australia, and about a year later, I had an answer of why I was there. But that first year was pretty miserable. And even in a lot of life journeys, we don't get that answer of why he's called us to be in a particular place at a particular time. I was sure, and in his grace, he gave me an answer of why I was back in Australia. But we don't always get that. What I could see was that his timing was 100% right. And that his will is good for us. So when Rachel and I went, we went with an agency called Interserve. So we talked about different agencies we thought we might go with, and we looked at a few. We had some connections to different ones, and we decided to go with Interserve because they had experience in the region, and we had experience with them in relationship there. We liked their approach. They had a good short-term framework, and they had a really great history of empowering women in ministry because it started as a women's-only mission. So they really kind of had thought about a theology of how to resource women in mission as well. So for all those reasons, we went with Interserve for that time. Interserve's not the only agency out there. The important thing in this context was that we went to a community, an organisation, a sending agency who knew something about where we wanted to go, and we discerned with them whether it was a good idea to go and what to do and how to do it well while we were over there, and we did the training they recommended. Sometimes God calls us, and that call is the start of discernment and training. In fact, it's very unusual for God's call to be met like that, for him to ask you to get on a plane right away. We met with this agency, we met with our communities, we prayed with our family and friends and with each other. In discerning God's call, we don't just hear from him or feel his prompt, we asked our community, the body of Christ, to help us discern as well. I'd like to tell you another story. This one's from the Bible. And we'll switch to the next slide because this photo describes or shows the flat roofs I'm about to describe in the story. So the story takes place in the book of Acts, and it starts in a town called Caesarea. Now in Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, and Cornelius was the head of a big division of Roman soldiers. But Cornelius was also very respected in his local community, very faithful, and he prayed every day, and he and his family were generous to the poor. And one day, as he was praying, he had a vision of an angel come to him, and the angel said, "Cornelius." So he knew it was him who was coming to talk to. And Cornelius said, "What?" Because that is a freaky apparition to see appear in your prayer time. And the angel said, "God has seen you. He has seen your prayers and your faithfulness and your generosity, and he's pleased with it. Now go, send someone to a town called Joppa and look for a man named Simon Peter, and he's staying in the house of Simon the tanner by the seaside." This is very specific. Don't get the wrong Simon or the wrong tanner. You need to send someone. And then the angel disappears. And as soon as that happens, Cornelius gets up and he calls his two most faithful servants and his one most faithful soldier. He tells them what's happened, and he sends them on a 2-day journey to Joppa. Meanwhile, in Joppa, we do have Simon Peter, and he is staying at the house of Simon the tanner. And he goes up on the flat roof of his house to pray. And as he's praying, it comes to about midday, and he starts to get really hungry. So his host starts to prepare him a meal. And while that's being prepared, he's praying some more, and he goes into a trance, and he sees a picture too. His picture's a little different, though. It's not an angel. It's a sheet coming down from heaven, suspended by 4 corners, and filled with all sorts of animals, but not the animals that Jews are allowed to eat. And so Peter sees this sheet full of animals, and he hears a voice, and it says, "Peter, Peter, you're hungry. Peter, get up, kill and eat." And Peter says, "No, I would never eat an animal that is unclean for Jews to eat. I would never break God's law in that way." And the voice says again, "Peter, get up, kill and eat." And this happens 3 times, and then whoop, the sheet is taken back up to heaven. And Peter's left there sitting, trying to figure out what the heck he just witnessed and trying to discern what God might have been telling him. And at that moment, the 3 men from Caesarea arrive at the house. And they are asking downstairs, do you have a man named Simon Peter staying with you? And in his spirit, Peter feels a prompt, and God's Spirit says to him, go downstairs, there are 3 men looking for you. Don't be afraid to go with them, I've sent them. And so he goes downstairs to this Roman soldier and these 2 Roman servants, and he says, I'm the man you're looking for. What can I do for you? So they explain what's happened, and he says, great, let's go. Let's set out tomorrow. We'll all have a rest, and then we'll set out tomorrow. He's probably still pretty hungry. So they set out the next day with some church members from Joppa as well, and they go to Caesarea. And when they arrive at the house of Cornelius, Cornelius sees Peter coming, and he throws himself on the ground in front of him. And, sorry, that got really loud all of a sudden. Throws himself on the ground in front of him and starts to praise and worship him as if he's a god. And Peter says, whoa, dude, get up. I'm just a man like you. So Cornelius takes a breath and welcomes Peter into his house. And Peter comes in and he sees that the house is full of Cornelius' family. And so he says to them, you know, traditionally in my culture, it would not be okay for me to spend time with a Gentile, as someone who's not a Jew, let alone come into a house full of them. But God has recently challenged me to realize that there is no group of people who is unclean. So I came willingly when I was asked, what is it that you would have me do? Why did you call me? And so Cornelius explains his picture, his vision that he had, how he gathered his whole family to hear. And Peter begins to tell them the good news. And in that moment, the world is changed. Both men spent time in prayer. Both men waited on God. Both men were seeking God before this in their lives. And both men said yes when God sent them and when he appeared to them. Peter went with people who would be considered his enemies. He might have thought he was going to his death. But both obeyed when God called and had front row seats to his gospel at work. We don't always know why and how God calls us to where he does. But when we say yes, we get to see his work and we get to be a part of his story. So what's your story? Where does it fit in with God's story? And where might he be calling you to go? Well, there's a couple of places to start if you're wondering. We start with prayer. We start as Peter and Cornelius did, living our lives to honor God and in prayer to listen to him. Has anyone here read The Cross and the Switchblade? It's a real 80s era book. All right, we've got about 3. Awesome. Okay, the rest of you, I'd recommend go and read it. Do be prepared for just a slightly, generational tone. But it's an awesome story of an American minister who felt God's call to go and work with gangs in New York. And it's really encouraging and profound and challenging to read. But it doesn't start with David Wilkerson, who's the guy who wrote the book, in New York. It actually starts with him in a little country town where he's the minister of a little country church. And he has been doing good work in this church. He describes how when he arrived, it was pretty small and he'd been there for a few years and it was growing and they were thinking about getting a new building, or maybe they already had because they'd grown so much. He was doing God's good work in that place. But he describes how each night, after doing God's good work, he would sit down and between the hours of 12 and 2 a.m., so man after my own heart, he would sit and watch TV. And he would just switch off, do a bit of, the original doom scrolling, channel flicking, and just watch TV mindlessly for a couple of hours just to switch himself off a bit. And one night, as he's sitting there about 1 a.m. and he's watching some random show, he just finds himself thinking, why am I watching this? Is this a good use of these 2 hours between 12 a.m. and 2 a.m.? And he wonders if maybe it's not. So he starts to pray, maybe I should get rid of my television. But he doesn't really want to get rid of his television. So he gives God a sort of test, like Gideon, but he makes it really quite difficult for God to fulfill this test. So he says, God, okay, I will put my TV up for sale on the original equivalent of Gumtree or Facebook Marketplace, but I need someone to contact me before, let's say, 5:30 tomorrow, and they need to be willing to just come and pick it up without having looked at it. They need to be not interested in the price, and they need to just come and take it away that day. So that happens, the day dawns, and he's waiting, watching the clock, and the hours tick by, and it gets to about 5:20, 5:25, and the phone has not rung, and he's like, it's okay, I get to keep my TV, yes. God's not mad at the TV. So he's really, feeling quite relieved about this, and at 5:25, he gets a phone call. And he picks it up, and this guy says, is the TV still available? He's like, yes. He's like, great, can I come get it now? He's like, you don't want to see it or know how much it is? He's like, no, that's fine, I'll come get it. He's like, okay. So he hangs up, he sells his TV, and he then spends those 2 hours from 12 a.m. to 2 a.m. in prayer. And it is after weeks of this that he feels God's call to go to New York. And after that call, he goes to his church community and he discerns with them, do you think this is right? Can you help me go? But it is only after he makes that time. Now, I'm not great at switching off my phone between 12 and 2 a.m., selling my TV. So I'm feeling convicted in this story. But we can start small. I'm trying to do a fasting thing 1 day a week where I just put away my social medias just for that day and to see what God prompts me to pray about in that time. It's not super comfortable, but it's so good to be listening to God. Will you make time for prayer? One call leads to the next. We can pop on to the next slide. So we start where we are and we say yes to God. And I felt called to Turkey, and that was great. And I got there to work with Muslim theological students, and that was apparently not it. So I thought that was what my call was. God had other ideas. He gave me the next piece of the puzzle when I was there. And after 3 months, I had the next piece, which was it's time to come back to Australia. And I realized that for that season, my call was to care for my family in Australia. Now, I do want to take a moment on this because we talk about calls, and we talk about calls overseas, and I'm so excited for your guys' call overseas. And we talk about calls into adventure. And I remember talking to a friend of mine and saying, it's a bit strange. I had a life that felt very obviously called. I was doing good work overseas. And now I'm back in Australia, and I know this is the right thing to do, and I know that I'm here to look after my family in this time, in this season. But does it look like I've just kind of stopped or slowed down? Will people think that I've just given up adventure or passion for faith? Or what about, do I think I've given that up as well? A 9-to-5 job and living in the eastern suburbs used to be my worst nightmare. Look at me now. So I remember asking and sort of saying, I'm finding this a bit difficult, knowing it's the right thing, it's what God has told me to do, but it's hard. And she told me a story about how she had just finished her degree in the sciences and was just setting out to start applying for jobs in an area she was passionate about when some stuff went down in her family and her one remaining parent left. And so she was left with 2 teenage siblings to look after, to effectively raise for about 2 years. So she couldn't go for a risk-taking job. She had to go for an easy job to get in a community that would support her so she could make sure her siblings finished high school and make sure they had a roof over their head. And her call from the outside didn't look exciting, but her call was so big and her saying yes was so huge, and God saw that. Where is God calling you to be? Are you happy to say yes? So where to next? What do we do then? We've heard hopefully a decent sermon. What do we do when we go home? Do I think about God's call, or is it just carry on as usual? Some questions that are helpful to ask are, what is God doing in you, in your life, in your heart? And what is God doing around you, in your community, in your neighbours, in your classmates, in your workplace, in your family? What is God doing overseas? Is that somewhere that he is calling you? Where could he use you in your family, in your neighbourhood, in your school or work community, or overseas? And when you think about, is God calling me somewhere a bit different? Choose one first step. You don't need to figure out the next 20 years. I guarantee you, if you figure out the next 20 years, you will realise that 19 of those were wrong about a year in. God doesn't give us 20 years in advance. So pick a first step. Pick something that is interesting to you. God is not asking you to become a person who is interested in something else. If you have no interest in preaching, don't feel like the only way to serve God is to be a preacher. I can guarantee that. Pick something that is challenging, that will take you a little bit out of your comfort zone, that will push you to grow and learn, even just a little bit at a time. Pick something that is realistic. Now, the joke I make about this is, don't pitch something that says, well, I'll do 3 doctorates and 2 qualifications in emergency medicine, and then I will be able to serve God, but not before that. But actually, the more serious question is, how many times have you chatted to someone, or perhaps you've thought yourself, well, I'm just going to get stable and settled. I'm just going to get my job, get a bit of savings in my account. And then after I've worked for 10 years and we'll make it a decade, that's a good round number, then I'm going to give half my money to God, or I'm going to go overseas, or I'm going to start serving in the church in that moment. Because I can almost promise you that if you are not saying yes to God now, you will not say yes to him in 10 years. Because we start how we want to continue. It's built in to the human nature that if we're not doing it now, if we're putting it off, it's almost certain we won't come back to it. Choose something realistic and choose something fun. Where is your joy? Where does God light you up? Where do you find life? Final question that is perhaps not specifically for this demographic, but maybe for a couple. I was listening to my dad, who, as I said, was a cross-cultural worker, and he's been back in Australia for the last 15 odd years, and he's just about to set out again, heading back to the Middle East as a cross-cultural worker again. He's about 67, 68 years old. And he was sharing with a small group, John and Jenny, the other night, and he asked, where are you going to spend your retirement? Because he's spending his retirement on the field. Where is God calling you to spend your retirement? Is it on the golf course with your buddies? Now, the theology of golf is a different discussion. And perhaps, certainly people who play golf need Jesus as much as anyone else. But where is God calling you? Because there's not a point at any stage in life where he says, all right, now you've done the hard work. It's all right, just knock off early. You can do whatever you want for the next 30 years. It's fine. If we want to say yes to God, we start now and we say yes every day and every year for the rest of our lives. Let me pray. Father, what a big question, what a confronting moment. What does it mean to say yes to you every day and every year for the rest of our lives? God, I pray that you would be calling us, that we would feel your prompt in our hearts, that you would give us your discernment, your wisdom, your people, and your guidance to follow you where you would have us go, to serve you as you would have us serve you, and to live a life that is what we were created to be and that brings you glory. Father, I pray that you would guide us, prompt us, challenge us, and in all things call us closer to yourself. In Jesus' name, amen.